This evening I'm going to talk about the architectural history of Awatovi Pueblo. And Awatovi is located just east of Hopi, southwest of Keams Canyon. If you have Keams Canyon here, there's Awatovi. It's on this mesa called Antelope Mesa, which is, if you have, people always talk about Hopi having first mesa, second mesa, and third mesa, actually going east to west. From your view, it would be first mesa, second mesa, third mesa, where Aribi is. Antelope Mesa is kind of the east mesa of Hopi. And in the 1200s, there were quite a few large Pueblo sites along the edge of Antelope Mesa. Awatovi was founded about 1200 AD. And over the next 350 years, it grew to be a pueblo of about 1,000 people. And that made it the largest pueblo on Antelope Mesa. And by about 1500 or so, it was the only pueblo left on Antelope Mesa. All of the others had been vacated. Awatovi was probably visited, almost certainly visited, by the Coronado expedition in 1540, but the Coronado expedition did not mention it by name. In 1583, the Espejo expedition definitely went to Awatovi and mentioned it by name. In 1598, Juan de Oñate colonized New Mexico, and he made a trip over to the Hopi area, definitely visited and mentioned Awatovi. In 1604, he made another trip through Awatovi on his way to California. Then in 1629, the Spaniards established a mission, a Franciscan mission at Awatovi. It was one of three missions at Hopi. In 1680, of course, all of the pueblos of the Southwest revolted against the Spaniards, drove them completely out of New Mexico to El Paso. There were four Spanish priests at Hopi, two at Aribi, one at Shangopavi, and one at Awatovi, and they were all killed. In 1692, Juan de Vargas reconquered New Mexico. He went over to Hopi, and Awatovi was the only pueblo at Hopi that was willing to accept the Spaniards' return and say that they would become once again Spanish citizens or Spanish subjects. In 1700, then all of the other pueblos, the other Hopi pueblos, destroyed Awatovi because they had accepted the return of the Spaniards. From 1935 to 1939, the Harvard Peabody Museum conducted excavations at Awatovi and at 19 other sites on Antelope Mesa. And what they were trying to do, what they succeeded in doing, was studying the archaeology of change in the Hopi country from their earliest site dated to about 670 AD. It was Jedito 264. And then they had sort of a continuous string of sites going all the way to Awatovi in 1700. The director of the Harvard Peabody Awatovi expedition was Joe Brew. And he's shown here at the Awatovi camp. They had a pretty big camp because they had about 20 or 30 people, specialists, archaeologists working there. That included geologists and botanists and ceramic analysts and crew chiefs and so on and so forth. They also hired every year between 9 and 19 Hopis, Hopi workmen, so that over the 5 years of the project, there were about 30 Hopis who worked on the project. Many of them came back year after year after year. The person who really took all the notes and really did supervised the actual field work at Awatovi was Al Lancaster, shown here also at the camp. Today, archaeologists have forms that we fill out that prompt us to record information about, the data that we're excavating. And but Al Lancaster, he just filled out little 4x8 site cards. But he was really, really consistent in what he recorded. He would, give you for every room, he would tell you what the subdatum was, and he would then go through all of the different levels and describe each level of the fill in the room. He would describe the artifacts that came out of each level, and then he would get down to the floor and he would he'd do a little sketch map of the floor and the features there, and describe the floor itself and the walls. And he just did a really good job, even though he was using this really simple system. They also divided the site of Awatovi into these, what they call grid blocks. Each one measured about 30 meters east-west by 25 meters north-south. And they did these wonderfully detailed maps of each of those, of their excavations within each of those grid blocks. In 1935, this is kind of what the site looked like when at the end of their first year. There are some features here that are important. This is the western mound of Awatovi, and it's the oldest part of the site. It dates from like the 1200 to about the mid-1300s. And after that, you got the construction of all of these other little room blocks and stuff. As the western mound sort of declined and fell into ruin, they were building these other room blocks out here that you could sort of see in 1935. Ultimately, the site was concentrated over here at the eastern mound, which is right in here. And the Spanish mission was in this area, and there were just a few standing walls in 1935. They had really no idea. There really hadn't been that many big sites in the Southwest excavated in 1935, and they really weren't quite sure what to expect. So they dug this long trench, this north-south trench, to kind of explore the site in 1935. Over the next 5 years of the project, they expanded out from that. And they estimated, Joe Brew anyway, estimated that there were about 5,000 rooms at Awatovi. And I think he's absolutely right about that. Brew claimed that they dug 1,500 of those rooms. They didn't, actually. They dug a mere 750. Actually, a mere 741, I think, rooms at Awatovi. They started in 35 was the trench. 36 and 37, they worked on these early rooms in the western mound. And as you can see here, it was a big square mound, and they sampled sort of the front, the south part of it. And then they also started digging these tests scattered around the site. In 37 and 38, they concentrated on the Spanish mission, which is over here. And then in 39, they just kind of finished things up. After the project was finished, they proceeded to crank out reports about the project as a whole, and they did a study of the geology and the environment of Awatovi. They did. There was one on the mission. It's called Franciscan Awatovi by Ross Montgomery. Watson Smith and Joe Brew. There was also a volume by Watson Smith on the Kiva Murals, which we see here. There was one on Kivas, the 22 Kivas that were excavated. There was another on the pottery from the Western Mound. There were lots of these little specialized books. There was one on animal bone from Awatovi. There was another one on the stone implements that were recovered from the project. They wanted to do a volume on the architecture, but they never got around to it, and so that's kind of where I came in. One of the most significant findings of the entire project was, of course, the Kiva Murals. These are murals that were lining the walls of many of the subterranean ceremonial Kivas at Awatovi. In some cases, those Kiva walls were plastered. In some cases, they had layer upon layer upon layer of plaster, and it wasn't every layer that was painted, but many of them were. They would clean them off. They would record them, as you see here. And in 14 cases, they were actually able to peel the mural off the wall. They would expose it like that. They would spread glue across it, and then put like burlap, glue that to the image, and then they would take a scout knife and they would start cutting the image away, still attached to the burlap, and then once they got the whole thing removed, they would glue it onto a board, and then use a solvent to remove the glue that connected the burlap to the painting, and peel off the burlap, and they would have the mural on a board that they could remove. If I tried that, you would have about 10 million pieces of plaster, you know. But again, in 14 cases, they were able to accomplish that. 10 of those are at Harvard, but 4 of them are at the Museum of Northern Arizona. And this is the one that's on exhibit currently in the Archaeology Gallery. In 1997, the Harvard Peabody Museum, the Hopi tribe, and the Museum of Northern Arizona got together and decided to do a study of all of these mural fragments. And they wanted to do conservation on them. And then they also were talking about doing an exhibit, which never quite materialized, unfortunately. But I was brought in to sort of talk about to do some studies of the context of the murals, to talk about the context in which the Kivas were positioned, and where they were on the site, and how they fit in with the growth and development of Awatovi. And I just sort of kept working on that over the years until I finally produced a report. I did a draft about 3 or 4 years ago, and I submitted a revised draft about a year ago to the Harvard Peabody Museum. about my findings. So I'll just sort of start with the walls and go from there. The walls of Awatovi were made of the local sandstone, which is really soft and terrible. And they had to build by just kind of putting these blocks of sandstone into tons and tons, really large amounts of mortar. And then they would plaster over it. In this case, the Peabody Museum, the researchers peeled away the plaster from this rectangle to expose the masonry, but this was originally all covered with this kind of a brown plaster. It was just clay, sort of a brownish clay that they wiped over there, but most of the rooms were actually plastered in this way. You can see there's no real coursing of the masonry or anything like that. It's pretty basic. The vast majority of the rooms at Awatovi are just one stone wide, as you see here. We call it simple masonry. And that does not really give you enough support to generally to be able to build a multi-storied building. So I think that most of Awatovi was probably only 1 story tall. The major exceptions to the simple 1 stone wide masonry are in the Western Mound, and the earliest parts of the Western Mound, where they actually did do 2 stones wide, which did in some cases allow them to have multi-storied construction. Wall features that we see there include, of course, doorways, which are not really that common. You know, out of those like 500 rooms that I studied, I should say, the Awatovi expedition, I mentioned that they had dug 741 rooms at Awatovi. 197 of those rooms were in the mission. And there's that wonderful report by Montgomery, Smith, and Brew that describes the mission in detail. So that left a mere 544 rooms that had never been described. And those are the ones that I focused on. And those were primarily the rooms in whereas the mission, was Spanish, that served the people of Awatovi. The rest of the village, of course, was just occupied by Native Americans, and that was the architecture that I was most interested in looking at. So you look at walls like this, or in this case, we've got a set of doorways. Doorways were not particularly common. There were only about 110 of them in the entire site. Virtually all of them were rectangular. There were 2 T-shaped doorways at the site. Benches were fairly common. I think there were about 60 benches, and they were highly variable. They could be only a few centimeters tall, and they could range from actually being only a few centimeters wide to being really wide and tall benches like this. But with 60 of them, that sort of suggests fewer than 1 out of 10 rooms had a bench. Here you can see this also has a doorway. And slab-lined hearths were probably one of the most common features in Awatovi rooms. Usually they were up against the wall. They were usually rectangular and slab-lined. But I think there must be, again, there's over 100 hearths, I think, in the 500 rooms that I studied. This is a very rare feature, this ventilator shaft. There's only like 14 or 15 of those in the 500 rooms I looked at. This is in the western mound. And of course you had, so the fresh air would have come down into the room here and flowed around this deflector stone so that it wouldn't put out the fire that was in this slab-lined fire pit, which in this case is D-shaped, which is kind of unusual. Again, as I said, most of the fire pits were rectangular. Floors were almost always just earthen. Kiva floors were essentially always slab-lined, but for the living rooms and the storage rooms and things like that, they were just earthen floors. This particular room has a few slabs out in here. I think that's a slab there. There were a few slabs at this end of it. We have a little bin. This upright slab here is demarcating at the edge of a storage bin. And then this is another one of these rectangular slab-lined hearths that were so common at Awatovi. I mentioned there was a storage bin in the last slide I showed. Here's another one that is really kind of confusing because of what actually happened here was this room had originally 2 floors. There was a floor here, and after a number of years, they remodeled the room and they filled up to here with earth and trash and so forth. And so there was a floor that was right along in this area. And the people who remodeled the room then dug down into those deposits that were in this area, dug this circular pit, lined it with sandstone, and then built a sort of masonry and mortar coping around the top of that, and then capped it with a slab. And so and this is a fairly unusual feature, but if you had seen it when it was actually in use, you wouldn't have seen these slabs here because they would have been buried. But that's, I think, an interesting, and probably one of the most elaborate storage bins at the site. Another storage feature that is, again, not real common at the site, there's only half a dozen of them, are jars that are buried in floors. Again, say 7 examples of that out of 540 some rooms. 544 rooms. So here's the distribution of room types that we found in those 440 rooms. There were 25 Kivas, 112 residential rooms, and those are rooms that I would define as having a fire pit, a hearth or something like that in them. 211 storerooms, which are rooms that have no floor features at all. They're just basically empty rooms. There were 31 sort of other specialized types of rooms, like granaries, milling rooms, or corn grinding rooms, weaving rooms, and so forth. And then there were about 123 that I couldn't figure out what they were. In most cases, it was because they were only partly excavated. They didn't excavate the entire room. And then there were 42 outdoor spaces scattered around the site that include things like plazas and courtyards and corridors between room blocks. The Kivas at Awatovi were the standard rectangular Hopi-style Kivas that you first see being developed in about 1275 AD. They were rectangular, subterranean. They had slab-lined floors. They had a bench at one end. In this case, the bench is here, with a ventilator shaft going down and a tunnel then connecting it with the main room, deflector stone, slab-lined fire pit, and then all of these loom holes along here, because of course Kivas are where the Hopi men do their weaving. And there were 25 of those. Watson Smith, in a book called Prehistoric Kivas of Antelope Mesa, described 22 of them. There were 3 that he didn't get around to. I talked about them a little bit in my report, summarized what Watson Smith had said, and then presented new data on about 3. Living rooms, residential rooms, again, I described as being, or I classified them as having fire pits. And in some cases, these rooms were tiny, tiny, tiny little things. I mean, here, this has got a couple of fire pits. This one being sort of just a pit. This one having at least one slab lining it. I think there's a slab there as well. And there's almost no room for a person in there, just because there are so many, it's so small to begin with, and then to have a couple of features in there. But that was something I would classify as a residential room. The storerooms were generally empty, just rooms without any floor features. This particular room is interesting because it has these floor ridges running across it that indicate it's a granary, a corn granary. Those are called crib ridges, because when people would stack their corn, they would sort of abut the corn against these ridges that kind of form the foundation to start a big stack of these sort of, well, you've seen the way, I assume, seen the way that people stack Hopi corn, just kind of lining it up and just stacking it up against walls, and then if you have a ridge at the bottom, it kind of holds it together there. There weren't very many milling rooms or corn grinding rooms. This is one of about 3 on the site, and you can tell because it's got these bends all along here where they would have put these metates, and you have examples of metates here, and then manos that were used for grinding corn. Again, that's something that every household would have had to grind corn, and in some cases different Pueblo groups will have lots of these corn grinding rooms where women from an entire segment of the village, maybe an entire clan or maybe a lineage, something like that, where all the women will come together and grind corn in a sort of communal cooperative effort. Again, at Awatovi, there's like 3 examples out of those 500 rooms. The growth of Awatovi, the Hopi oral traditions describe how Awatovi formed over the centuries by having all of these immigrant groups coming in to Awatovi, mostly from the east and the south. And what I was interested in was looking at how the site grew from an archaeological standpoint. And one of the ways you can sort of trace and date Awatovi and the various parts of it is by looking at the pottery. They did get about, over 300 tree ring dates from Awatovi. One of the problems with the tree ring dates is that Awatovi is up on this mesa that really doesn't have any trees, maybe some juniper here and there, but there's not a lot of wood in that area. And so once a beam arrived at Awatovi, it got used and used and used and used. And if a room fell into disuse, they would, salvage the beam and take it over to the new construction. So some of the latest rooms at Awatovi actually have beams in them that are hundreds of years old. So it's a little difficult to use the beams, the tree ring dates to date the site. So what we've been doing, or what I did, and others have done, is to use the pottery. So that between 1200 and 1275, black on white pottery was dominant. From 1275 to 1325, orange ware pottery was dominant. From 1325 to 1375, black on yellow pottery was dominant. 1375 to 1629 was Sukiyaki polychrome. And then the mission period from 1629 to 1680, a pottery called San Bernardo polychrome was made. And so we can look at the distribution of that across the site to be able to figure out what each part of the site and what each room within the site actually dates to. So this is a fairly typical black on white bowl. That would have been sort of the most common type of pottery in that period from about 1200 to 1275. And if we look at, this is kind of a schematic diagram that shows the room block, the projected room blocks and projected rooms that probably existed at Awatovi. The places where you find black on white pottery are here and here. There's a couple of room blocks that seem to have been occupied during that period, the establishment period, when Awatovi was established between 1200 and 1275. And we don't know very much about those two room blocks because they were deeply buried, especially this one was way down in the lower levels of the western mound. And so we didn't really get a good picture of the overall layout of that room block. The next period, 1275 to about 1325, orange ware would have been the dominant pottery type. And you can see that the Pueblo is starting to expand. There were probably about 200 people living at Awatovi during the black on white pottery era. By the orange ware period, you might have had as many as 500. And they were concentrated, again, still in the southwest part of the site and along the southern edge of the western mound. And in fact, this is actually what we can see here is there's a room block with two kivas in front of it and another room block with one kiva in front of it, and they're separated by a plaza there. Here's a more detailed view of the Awatovi expedition's excavations in the western mound. And what we had here was this area is the black on white pottery part of the village. And there would have been rooms that continued up into this area, but they got covered, filled with trash and then covered over to form a plaza. And then this area right here, which consisted of about 40 rooms and a kiva here and a kiva here, was built largely as a single unit and probably was the residence of about 40 people who you can sort of imagine coming in from somewhere else and establishing this and it's probably a lineage, probably a group of people who are all related and who can trace their ancestry back to a single founder. Shortly after this was built, a similar type of building was constructed over here, another 40 rooms, and in this case had a single kiva in front of it. I'm going to show, the next slide is a photograph that's taken from right up here looking this direction. And so here you can see this lower section. These would have all been the black on white pottery rooms. These would have been filled in and turned into a plaza between the room block over here and the room block over here. This one over here would have, the one that had 40 rooms and 2 kivas in front of it. The room block extending over here had 40 rooms and 1 kiva. You'll also notice that these, as I mentioned earlier, these are slightly wider walls down here in the lower level of the western mound, wide enough that you know, probably 2 stones wide enough that that guy can actually stand on it, although we don't recommend that you do that. These were constructed in kind of an interesting way. Both the east and west room block were constructed using a process that we call ladder or spine construction, in which you build a long continuous wall like this, and a second long continuous wall here. And that forms a long corridor. And then you have people come in and subdivide that corridor into rooms by putting in little short cross walls that are abutted against the long spine walls. And in this case, that spine unit was almost entirely storage rooms, the ones that don't have anything in them. The H there stands for a habitation room or a residential room, a room that would have had a fire pit in it. So you form that first block of rooms. And then basically each family can then construct their own habitation room out in front of the storerooms. And so, you know, these are constructed at sort of a family level. This would have been constructed originally, the spine unit would have been constructed by a cooperative group of multiple households. And then these rooms in the back and also these rooms out in front were all then added later as the village continued to grow. And both the east and west unit were constructed in this same way. And it's kind of, it's a pattern that you see all the way from Awatovi to practically, I think, the Rio Grande in New Mexico. You know, I've certainly seen it in the Zuni area and even further to the east. It's a way in which a founding group of maybe 10 or 20, 30 people can start a construction very quickly and put together a building that can be occupied by the whole group in a fairly rapid way. Okay, from about 1325 to about 1375, the most common pottery is this black on yellow pottery. And this is amazing stuff, of course. This is, whereas the previous pottery was fired using wood, beginning about 1325, the Hopis started mining coal, which occurs naturally in their, on the mesas. And they began firing their pottery with coal, which gives you this really hard and kind of golden yellow color. But it also, it's really a hard paste that when you tap it, it kind of rings. During that yellowware period, the black on yellow period, the western mound continued to grow as I described, you know, where you get sort of these added on rooms. You probably had additional spine units or ladder units being constructed all around this thing, and they continued, and then those would be added onto. And so ultimately you have this really big square building with kind of a plaza right in the middle. And then they also, and this is, the next step would have been to add some more room blocks to open or to create an even larger plaza here, and then adding still more room blocks out in this direction to create a plaza there. And that kind of process of going from a few small linear pueblos to a big square pueblo to adding a big plaza out in front is something that you see at 4 Mile Ruin, which is down by Snowflake and Taylor. You see it in the Homolovi area, at Homolovi 1 and Chevelon Ruin, in the Winslow area. To me, it's like a sort of southern style of developing a site. Bidahochi is that way. There's a lot of sites that are south of Hopi that developed in this particular way. And so, to me, that sort of is evidence of people from the south moving into Awatovi and establishing the Pueblo and growing the Pueblo. From 1375 to the establishment of the mission in 1629, you got this amazing pottery, Sukiyaki polychrome, coal-fired, and probably the most technologically difficult pottery ever made in the American Southwest. Looking at Sukiyaki, the distribution of Sukiyaki polychrome, you see that by this time the Western Mound has fallen into disuse, and it's just an abandoned area, vacated area, and it's actually become a mound. But the Pueblo has continued to grow to the north and to the east. And you have, an immense plaza here and an immense plaza over here. This is the eastern mound. This is where the mission will eventually get established. Sukiyaki room blocks tend to be long and narrow, like that one there, that one there, that one there. There were probably, this is kind of a group of agglomerated room blocks where one's built on top of another, and so it kind of looks like one giant room block, but probably that's deceptive. It was probably a group of long linear room blocks that kept being built and falling into disuse and being built on top of, and so forth. This looks like you've got a huge number of rooms being occupied, but the Sukiyaki period is 250 years long. So, whereas the previous periods we've been talking about were only 50 years long. And one of the things that we really need to do is look at Sukiyaki polychrome and break it down into sub types, which my wife Kelly Hayes Gilpin has certainly made a start on doing. And so ultimately, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to break this period down into finer periods and go into a little more detail on how the Sukiyaki growth occurred, again in more detail. One thing about Sukiyaki rooms too is that they tend to be long and narrow. They're quite a bit bigger than, whereas most of the rooms in the Western Mound were like this kind of size and shape. With Sukiyaki rooms, you start to see these longer rooms, and they're really oriented north-south, which is completely different from the way these rooms tended to be in the earlier periods, like in the Western Mound. The rooms tended to be oriented in a more east-northeast to west-southwest sort of way, which again, I think we're looking at people coming in from somewhere else who aren't accustomed to doing things the way the local people did. And I haven't quite figured out where these people are coming from, but again, my inclination is that it's somewhere south. You look at sites here in the Verde Valley, like Tuzigoot, and they have pretty big rooms, as opposed to these little tiny rooms that we were seeing in the Western Mound and the earlier periods. And this is just a photograph of some of those long north-south oriented rooms. By the time the Spaniards got to Awatovi in 1540, when Coronado came through, the site had probably taken this form, sort of a defensive kind of square, built around a plaza. This is the map made by Victor and Cosmas Mendeleev from their work at the site in 1882. They noted that there was just this one access entry point. There was a gate right here. And in fact, that's actually that is a formal gate. When the Awatovi expedition excavated it, you've got this nice masonry row, stone blocks forming a sill, and then a wooden sill also that would have supported some gates, and then another row of masonry. Let me go back. This is the area in which, in the Sukiyaki period, in the late Sukiyaki period, this was all still inhabited, and there were Kivas in here. And this is where, though, when the Spaniards came in 1629, this is where the mission would end up being built. Which, gives you an idea of the mission itself, which was an enormous undertaking. It was, again, established in 1629. They started out by trying to build this large sanctuary here, which was 65 meters long, 20 to 30 meters wide, and they never finished building it, probably because they couldn't get any beams long enough to span this and put a roof on it. So they started some walls there and then gave up on it. This is the church that actually was completed. It was a little shorter. It was about 60 meters long, about 12 and a half meters wide. You had a baptistry here and a parlor there and two bell towers here at the entrance, then a long sanctuary. And then the altar in this right there was built over two kivas, both of which were filled with clean sand, just to kind of show who's in charge here. Then you had sacristies in here where vestments and sacred stuff, the wine and the host and that kind of stuff would have been kept in there. This was a friar's chapel. There was like a library here. These would have been offices and residences. There was a central garden in this area that was surrounded by sort of a bunch of rooms that opened onto the garden. And then the kitchen and that kind of facilities were out in here. And then further out in this area, you had things like corrals and so forth for your livestock. There was obviously, the Spaniards brought in or made a lot of changes. Number one, they took control of labor, which you would have needed, since you had like one priest living here at any given time. And you would have had some Hopi converts living there as well. But the whole thing was constructed by the local people. They also brought in livestock, sheep and goats, and the local people, the church kept control of the livestock. They were herds that belonged to the church, but the local people had to take care of them. And they introduced peaches, orchards and stuff. And again, these were tended by Hopis, but Hopis were actually required to work each individual is required to work about 3 days a week for the mission. One of the things that resulted from these various changes, the control of labor by the Spaniards, as well as the introduction of sheep and goats, is that we got a new kind of pottery, and it's called San Bernardo. Usually San Bernardo polychrome, although this is San Bernardo black on yellow. You can see it's a much cruder type of pottery. It wasn't fired with coal, it was fired with sheep dung. So it's a much softer pottery. And it also takes, in this case, you've got basically a soup bowl shape, which is something that you didn't have before. So you're getting Spanish introduced vessel form as well. And this isn't as good a slide, but if you look at the location of San Bernardo pottery at the site, you've got, obviously the mission area was here. The eastern mound was kind of the core area of where most of the people lived, but there were some room blocks built in the plaza, and then some more out around the edges of the site, and that's where the San Bernardo polychrome is, and that's where the native people of Awatovi were living during the mission period. The eastern mound, the Awatovi expedition dug a trench basically right through the middle of it here to look at the rooms in that part of the site, and that's just a view of it. They dug about 32 rooms in that trench, and I believe it was 9 of them were habitation rooms, 8 of them were storage rooms. There was one milling room, corn grinding room in that group. There was also a room that looked like it was used just for weaving. And as I mentioned before, historically the Hopi men weave in the Kivas. So it's kind of unusual that you would have just a secular room that was being used for weaving. But I think it makes sense because it probably represents people producing woolen garments to be turned over to the church to then be sold down in Mexico to provide funding for the mission system. Let's see. So in 1680, as I mentioned, all of the pueblos of the Southwest revolted against the Spaniards and drove them out of New Mexico. They were gone for a dozen years. And 1692, de Vargas returned and reconquered the Southwest. And Awatovi was was the only Hopi Pueblo that agreed to accept the Spaniards back. And I had mentioned that, we had these first two churches. This was one that was never completed because it was too big. This is the one that was occupied during the mission period at Awatovi. And it was destroyed completely during the Pueblo Revolt. And then the Hopi people, although that was destroyed, the rest of this building got occupied by local people. And they subdivided all those big rooms into tiny little Hopi rooms. And so when the Spaniards came back, they opened up this whole row of rooms, which had originally been like several Spanish rooms, subdivided into a bunch of little Hopi rooms. And so they opened that up, and that became the third church at Awatovi that was in use from about 1692 to 1700. During that time, there was no permanently resident Hopi priest at Awatovi. They would just come out seasonally, basically. And in the in the summer of 1700, just north of the eastern mound, maybe I should go back, out in here, the Hopis, or the Spaniards, sent out some soldiers who began construction of a barracks and stable in that area. And I think that really sent the message to the Hopi that the Spaniards were planning to come back with soldiers. And so when the soldiers and the priests went back to Santa Fe for the winter of 1700-1701, the other Hopi Pueblos attacked Awatovi and destroyed it. And there are stories that you hear that the other Pueblos kind of rushed in right before dawn, and the men were in the Kivas, and they pulled the ladders up out of the Kivas and set fire to the Kivas and killed the men in the Kivas. And then most of the women and children ended up being distributed to the other Pueblos. There's no question that Awatovi was destroyed during the winter of 1700-1701, and it was probably in the late fall or early winter of 1700. But the excavation, for example, that Harvard did, really found human remains in only about 7 rooms. And they didn't find any human remains. There was one Kiva that was excavated in the 1800s by Jesse Walter Fuchs, in which he claimed he had found the Kiva where the men were killed, because he was digging the Kiva and he found a skull. And the Awatovi expedition went back to that Kiva and completed the excavation, and they found some skull fragments and a few isolated human remains, but in the 25 Kivas that have been dug there, none of them so far has actually had, an assemblage of individuals who've been killed. There are also Hopi stories that tell, or that say that many of the people were warned ahead of time that this was going to happen, and so they fled. Many of them joined the Navajos permanently. Some of them joined the Navajos just for a year or so, and then kind of filtered back to Hopi after that. My sense of it is that certainly Awatovi was destroyed, and I don't doubt that people were killed as part of that, but I think the overwhelming majority of the people of Awatovi actually survived the destruction of the site and were distributed to other pueblos. So the final thing is when we were doing, just to give you, now that you've heard the story, when we were doing the study of the murals and planning on doing an exhibit, we put together a digital model of the development of Awatovi, and it's kind of a sketch. It's pretty crude, but what you'll see here is the establishment of two little pueblos in the period, in the black on white pottery period in the early 1200s, and then that'll grow into the Western Mound in the Yellowware or the Orangeware and Yellowware periods. The Western Mound will fall into disuse, and yeah. So there's the Western Mound that we're zooming in on. There's the first two little pueblos. You can see them expanding in the Orangeware period. And then it forms that big block, and then the two large plazas. And then the Western Mound falls into ruin and becomes a mound. And there you have the Sukiyaki period with these, and the Eastern Mound is at the top. And then you get the construction of the mission. And then Harvard arrives. So that's my story.